Hey, good to see you today. My name is Jake, and I have the privilege of being a pastor here at Hope Chapel, and it's so good to have you in the room. If you have battled through the elements, gold star attendance to all of you on Valentine's Day. And I don't know what your plans are for Valentine's Day. My Valentine is actually teaching in Lee's Summit, and so I'll see her later on. But guys, it's like negative 18 in the wind chill out there, so guys, good luck figuring that out and how you're gonna do it. But it's really good to be with you, and to be able to journey through this Connected to God series has been so life-giving, so much fun. We also wanna welcome everybody who's watching us online, and if you are at home in a high-risk situation, we both lament with you and are so glad that you decided to join in with us today through this Connecting to God series. The idea that we can connect to God in a variety of different ways is just a beautiful thing. And we've been doing this series, hopefully helping you to understand that you can connect to God at any time, constantly, and yet we're also going to probably connect to God in very different ways because we're all different people. Well, that's obvious. We all connect to each other differently because we're different people. We have different personality types, different strengths, different weaknesses. But you would be surprised how shocking, how revelatory this idea is that we connect to God in different ways in a lot of different churches. And here's why, right? We often say connect to God through Bible reading and through prayer. If you're spiritually seeking today, open up your Bible, just put yourself in a position to hear from God through prayer. That's a great way. But once you've been in church for a while, you begin to realize that there are a lot of different ways to do that. If you've ever tuned in to watch a Pentecostal service, they're worshiping, praying, and reading the Bible. And if you tune in to a Catholic service, they're worshiping, praying, and reading the Bible, but they do so very different. And so having this idea that we can connect to God in a variety of different ways is hopefully freeing for you. Because most people in their tradition tend to dictate the way that they met with God and try and proclaim that to everybody else. And so if you find yourself in one or two traditions almost your entire life, you're gonna be led to believe that that's the only way that I can connect to him. If I grew up in a Pentecostal church, man, shouting, celebration, that's gonna be the way that's celebrated. If I grew up in a Catholic church, I'm gonna think, man, this is rituals and rites and symbolism, and that's the way. What we gotta understand is that style is so important to people often feeling like they're validated or that they can connect to God, and not that they're led to believe that something's wrong with them, which is sometimes what happens. So we've been talking about connecting to God because we realize we're in a really interesting time. Can we just all agree? This is a really strange time. But being in this strange time is giving us an opportunity to see all the other ways of connection. And you need to recognize that the way that you connected to God in the last season may not be the primary way that you connect to him in this season. There have been seasons in my life where it was all about Bible reading and really studying and doling through what truth looked like, and that was really formational for me to knowing God. And then other times where it felt like my prayer life was on fire, like I couldn't spend enough time in prayer with God, and that was the way that I was primarily formed. There are going to be seasons where you respond one way, seasons you respond the next, and while we're in this very interesting time, this is a great time for you to sit back and recognize all of these different pathways and how God may be drawing you into a different one than he did in the last season. That's at least my hope for you. Because what I'm not trying to do is dictate to you how you need to connect to God. What I'm trying to do is open up and get rid of all the confusion and all the excuses to get you into his presence. We've been using Gary Thomas's book, Sacred Pathways, which came out several years ago, as a nice, helpful guide to recognizing at least 9 different pathways to knowing God. This is what Gary says in the opening of his book. He says, good spiritual counselors don't heal anyone. They try to bring the troubled soul into God's presence, remove the confusion, subterfuge of sin and self, and let God's Spirit have his way. That's all we're trying to do. We're trying to get rid of all of the distractions. You don't need to hear from me. I'm not the wise sage as much as I am just trying to point you in the direction of Jesus. Because I know that if you can meet with God, everything can change overnight. I know that. So all I'm trying to do is get rid of all the distractions, all of the confusion, and just open your lives up to a place where you can meet with him. That's all we want to do today. So I know we're all spiritually seeking for something. You did not get in your car and drive here in sub-zero temperatures just to hear from me. You came here because there was something deeper on the inside of you that longed for something more, didn't you? There was something on the inside that said, I need to connect to the Almighty God. Even if you're spiritually seeking, you're looking for something on the inside. That's what drew you into a church. You went to Target for whatever you went into. You came out with 15 more things than you planned on when you went in. You came to church today because there was an expectation in your heart that God was gonna do something in your life, that you were gonna meet with him. And that's all we're trying to do, is create the space for you to do this. Now, let me illustrate for you a little bit of what I'm talking about with this whole connecting to God. There are 9 different pathways that we're talking about in his book, but there are so many other pathways as well. For instance, like right now, the vast majority of our church is watching online. Hello, everybody. We're glad you're here. That means that our church is in hundreds of homes around Kansas City. There are gonna be people who watch us on YouTube, on Facebook, on church online platforms on our website. There's gonna be people who watched us at 9 o'clock, at 10:30, and then some who are gonna watch us on Tuesday night. And I know, because you're texting me, Pastor, just caught up with church today, it's Tuesday night, in the middle of the week. That's largely how we're connecting. And that's a great way for you to connect to God, because can you imagine, back with the Spanish flu 100 years ago, we didn't even have this option. We've been in this 11 months. And during these 11 months, I can't imagine if we had to shut our doors and just say, see you in a year. Think about the formation and what that would do to people's spiritual lives over time. So I am so thankful for a church online platform that allows people to be able to watch in other states and in other nations, in their homes, at work, on their phone, on their devices, whatever it is. I'm so grateful. But I want to use this moment to also say, with no shame attached, I promise you, no shame attached to everybody watching online, promise. But I want us to recognize, just as a case study this morning, since so many people are watching online, all of the deficiencies that come with just an online experience for 11 months. And if this is nothing more than to help us grieve what is lost, I think it's important to at least acknowledge what is lost, because there are many things that are lost. And often when I talk to people about church online, they go, oh, I get it. The thing that's missing is community. I'm not seeing people. That's where we often go to in our minds. But there's so many other things that are missing from a purely online church experience that we've lost with a vast majority of our congregation over the last 11 months. And it has massive repercussions in our lives and in our faith. Let me give you just a top 10. These are what I consider the top 10 things that are missing from a purely online experience. Number 1 is worship. Most people that I talk to anyway, most people are not singing and participating in worship. They're not in their living room standing and singing when everybody else stands. Now, there may be a few of you. There's probably all of you that are watching today are probably those people. But I know most people that I've talked to, that's not been their experience. Most people are not picking up on this collective sense of God's presence that happens when we all gather in a room together. I've been a pastor over 20 years, and we know there are certain moments where collectively God just seems to be in the room and at work with us, and that's very difficult to capture online. Number 3 is serving. Most people are not finding a meaningful place to serve the church from home. It's just not happening. It's not happening. Number 4 is bringing. Most people are not considering who to invite or bring to church. And I know that you can do a watch party with Facebook, and I know that for some of us, we've reached out to friends and family members, hey, watch this talk. And so I know some of it is happening, but man, there's a lot of people that have just kind of tuned out on bringing for the last 11 months. Communion, for a lot of people, communion. Most people are not having a quality communion experience. Prayer, most people are not thinking about praying with or for others through the laying out of hands, this very biblical means. Number 7, kids ministry. Most people are not thinking about the discipleship of their children on Sunday morning if they are tuning in. They're just allowing that to go to the wayside. Number 8 is community. Most people not experiencing the connection that the church provides. 9, authority and accountability. Most people are not considering the importance of spiritual authority, accountability in their life here on Sundays. And then number 10, of course, is just raw commitment that comes. Most people not thinking about the prioritization of meeting together as one and the way that we're formed. And this is not to mention all the classes and the courses and the programs that we've either had to cancel or modify over the last 12 months. Now, that could feel very much like a shame fest for some of us who are watching online today. And I don't mean it that way. What I'm trying to do is help you understand the level of deficiency of trying to connect to God through one lens alone. Through one lens alone. I can do the same thing with a Pentecostal sort of activist or celebratory approach that does not validate any of the rituals and rites of the last 2,000 years that draw us into some of the anchor points for our soul. Or over here, I can point to this tradition or that tradition. We can go through and talk about all the deficiencies, which should only cause us to take a step back and think there are so many ways to connect to God, and every time that I open myself up to a new one, I'm seeing a different side of who he is and opening up my heart in a new way. That's so valuable to all of us. And unfortunately, a lot of people just aren't going to teach this message because they're wrapped up in their tradition. But those traditions give us different lenses to help different people coming from different places to have a better view of what it means to love and connect to God. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking from what is known as the Shema from Deuteronomy 6:5. It's the central prayer of the Jews that would pray in the morning and in the evening. And it's this idea that we love God, what? With all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength. Jesus calls it the greatest commandment in the New Testament. To love God willfully, emotionally, mentally, and actively. In other words, holistically. To give him everything we've got. And what we're trying to do here over the last couple of weeks is to give you each week either the head, the heart, or the hands, which tend to be the primary expressions. A guy named Jonathan Edwards, several hundred years ago, he kind of doled this down as one of the individuals that we can thank for being able to say head, heart, and hands as being a really good way to think about your relationship with God. And we talked in week 1 about our hands and that active nature of what it means to connect to God. Last week, Sarah was here and talked about the heart and what that means just from an emotional and a willful sense to give our lives in worship to God. And today we're gonna finish off by looking at the head or the intellect, how we think about God through the lens of reason as well. If you have your Bible today, our central text is Colossians Chapter 3. And if you have a Bible, feel free to open up. The verses will be on the screen if it didn't make it with you. But we're going to read together from Colossians Chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. This is how it reads. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. So set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. And there's a lot going on here in the book of Colossians. And Colossae, this idea that needs to be presented is to a very confused church. Colossae is a church in a city that Paul's never even been to before. So the author, the Apostle Paul, is writing from prison. He's had one of his friends who's been leading this church come visit him at prison, and he's penned a letter to bring back to this church that's going through all types of turbulence. Well, here's a couple of things that's going on. Well, first off, they're in a trade city. Colossia's in a trade city, which means there's several ideas that are entering and exiting the city all the time, which means people are all over the place in their beliefs. On one side, you have the predominant culture that's believing in what is called polytheism, the idea that there are several gods to worship and honor. And at the center of this polytheism is to worship what is essentially Mother Earth. The reason for that is because the city in Colossae is seen as a city with several earthquakes. Quite frequently, just feeling the rumbling underneath has caused many of the people to respond saying, we have upset Mother Earth, we need to worship, we need to revere, we need to make everybody peaceful again because it's crazy. And so not only is Mother Earth part of that, but there are several other gods and goddesses that are served by the dominant culture. On the other side, they're dealing with Orthodox Jews, almost Judaizers, individuals who say, fine, that Jesus can be the Messiah, but there's there's all these other rules and regulations that need to be attached if you really want to follow after him. And so the church often started, and you see this with Paul's ministry all the time, by going to a synagogue amongst the Jewish community of that city and saying, I know you're all waiting for a Messiah. He's come. His name is Jesus. And then they formed a church. Well, some of these individuals have made it now into the church. They recognize Jesus as the Messiah, but they're saying it's Jesus and all of these rules from the laws of Moses and things that we've adopted over time. And so the church is confused, and their central question is this: is Jesus enough? Because if I talk to the dominant culture, they would say, Jesus is good, but you also need all these other gods to serve. And if I talk to the Orthodox Jewish community, they would say, Jesus is good, but you have all these other rules that you have to follow. And so the central question of this book is Jesus enough? And if you've read Colossians, then you look at chapter 1, and you see that all of chapter 1 is about the supremacy of Christ. Verses 18 through 26, it's like everything was founded in Christ and for Christ and through Christ. He is the center of it all. This is Paul's way of answering this fundamental question, is Jesus enough? And then in chapter 2, it kind of goes back and forth, looking at all of the other melu, all the mess that they're trying to work through. And then you get to chapter 3, which is what we read. And at the very beginning, it says what? Since then. Since then. In other words, Christ is supreme. Here's the mess. Since then, this is what you do. And theologians have called chapter 3 of Colossians all about the new humanity. It's the chapter on the new humanity, saying you can rise above all the mess because Jesus is enough. And he's called you into something more. He's called you into this new humanity, this new way of living. So rise up out of it. If you look at verse 1, it starts off by saying, since then, you have been raised to Christ. You've been lifted up out of the mess. You're invited into something better than everything else that you see. And so then he goes on to say, so set your heart on Jesus. And then what does he say? He says, set your mind not on earthly things, but on things above. Set your mind on things above. I gotta tell you, there is probably no better passage to describe the tension in my worship and connecting to God than this. Here's what I mean. So Christ has given us this incredible thing to be called out of. And if you've ever had a divine experience with God where you just felt so close to him, you just knew that God was at work in your life. Like you just wanna freeze that moment in time, don't you? You just wanna press pause on it and go, God, could we just have nothing change? Because this is so good. But what happens? Well, we're humans, we're changeable, and we got a lot of issues. And there's this tension that goes on inside of us between a dependency on God and wanting to draw close to God and independence, self-reliance, self-gratification. Our reputation gets wrapped up in that. And we constantly live in this tension, in this battle, in this war between dependency and independence, between desiring God and desiring to do our own thing. That's the tension that we all face. I meet people who walk into our church on a regular basis and they go, man, I just felt drawn in, like there was a desire to be dependent on God or to draw near to God. And then I get worried for them because I think, man, in a few weeks, I may never see him again when that dependency wears away and now it becomes a discipline. Now I've actually got to be intentional about it. And this is what Paul's saying. He's saying, you've been called out of something, but at the same time, if you want to live in that, you're going to have to be intentional. That means you're not always emotionally going to feel good and warm on the inside. You're not always going to want to do it. You're not always going to want to be dependent on God. You're going to have days where you don't. So set your heart and set your mind. Be intentional about it. Be authentic about it, but be intentional about it. Now, this idea of dependency is something that I think all of us can relate to. I was talking to one of my friends this last week, and she finished a 40-day fast, and then got all her friends together to hold a party and celebrate everything that God taught her over the 40 days. How many of your friends are like, hey, I just had a 40-day fast, and I'd like to have a little party to celebrate? I haven't been to too many 40-day fast parties. So I thought, okay, all right, let's get on. So we all got on Zoom from all over the country, and we got on, and she began to share all the things that she felt that God was speaking to her about. And she said about halfway through her fast, she's sitting there on the couch, and she's watching one of these shows, these dog training shows. And there's like an expert breeder talking about what it means to train a puppy, and then they end up selling these dogs for like $30,000. They train them for 3 or 4 months, and then they sell them. And what they do in order to determine the value of the dog is they place a dependency score on the dog. Now, here's what I mean by a dependency score. When the dog is little, they start to monitor how the dog responds to the human who comes in contact. How much does that dog want to be petted and rubbed? How much does that dog follow them around? And they assign, after a couple of weeks, something called a dependency score. And the higher the dependency score, the more that they think that next owner is probably going to enjoy the dog, because there's a natural tendency to want to be dependent and to cling to an owner. And they're able to sell those dogs for a lot more money. And so she's sitting on the couch and watching this TV show. And she sits back and just begins to pray, Lord, what's my dependency score? What does my dependency score look like? How reliant, how dependent am I of you on a regular basis? How much am I relying on things from 6 months or 12 months ago that I know? And how much is it that I'm just relying on you for today? Now, when we're talking about setting our minds, there's actually other passages of scripture to help us with this. 1 Corinthians 2:16b says, we have the mind of Christ. We have the mind of Christ. Now, this is Paul's response to Isaiah 40. In Isaiah 40, the question that the prophet is asking is, like, who can know the mind of God? And Paul is answering it by saying, we have the mind of Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit. Like, what a beautiful promise to us. 1 Peter 1:13 says, therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealing at his coming. In other words, set your mind not just on things above, but also on his return. Like, have this 30,000-foot view of what's really going on. Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but also be transformed by the renewing of your mind, meaning be alert and aware. And when you start to trail in a different direction, renew it and get back on the bus, get back in the right direction. So this idea of renewing your mind falls in line with this idea of having the mind of Christ. And having the mind of Christ for us means approaching every situation through the lens of Jesus. That means every relationship you have. That means what you do with your job or at school. Walking into the situation with the mind of Christ. Christ, how would you do this? How would you do this? How would you handle that situation? And this is where the whole dependency score thing comes in. Because I don't have to depend on God when I'm so filled up with my own independence that I don't care about what God has to do. I'm gonna do my own thing. But I am absolutely dependent on God. I'm absolutely dependent if I wanna have the mind of Christ. To be able to walk in and go, Lord, what would you do? This is a situation I have not seen. How would you respond? I need your wisdom. I need your understanding. I need your truth. That's huge. And it's what it means to love God with our mind, to love God with our reason. Now, we're gonna finish out our time here by discussing these 3 pathways that Gary Thomas has laid out. And they're all to do with our minds. Loving God with our intellect, loving God with our mind. And for some of you go, this is intuitive for me, and others of you go, this is just not me. And that's okay, because we have a couple of rules as we get into this. Number 1, we want you to know that every one of these pathways is a valid pathway and an important pathway for you to consider journeying in on, even if it doesn't come natural. Because remember what we said, a limited lens is a limited view of God. So we want to have a wider lens and learn to grow in all of these things. But then on top of that, this is also really helpful, because even if it doesn't fit you, it may help you to understand somebody in your life who is that way. You just go, oh, that makes sense. They're not crazy. I thought they were crazy, but they're not. This is just the way that they're approaching God, and it's a very different way to how I approach God. So let me give you the 3. Number 1 is an intellectual. There are intellectuals in the room, and these are people who love God with the mind. They love God with the mind. When the intellectuals' minds are awakened, they understand something new about God or people, and their worship is then unleashed. Like, these are the people who get really excited. Now, in our culture, admittedly, we live in a time where most people don't connect intellectualism to worship. That may have been before worship and music wasn't such an intertwined thing. That we make the connection now often with music as being a form of worship, but we don't often do that with intellectualism the way that we did 1,000 years ago. And so it's important for us to understand there is still this connection between intellectualism and our type of worship. It's just that there's a slightly different thing going on. So when we talk about worshiping in spirit and in truth, we have people who love to focus on spirit. Those are not just our activists, but they're also those who are deeply into celebration and enthusiastic worship unto God. That's fantastic. But for the intellectual, their form of worship isn't so much focusing on spirit as much as it is focusing on truth. The beauty of the intellectual is they're saying, every time I learn more about God and have greater clarity around what truth is, I feel like I'm connecting deeply to him. And that's valid, but it's not just valid, it's vital for all of us. To all be willing to step in and be in a pursuit of truth. Listen, you can chase after experience after experience after experience, get to the end of your life and realize you were totally wrong of how you read each one of those experiences. We have to be in a pursuit of truth as much as we are in a pursuit of what is God saying today to our spirit man. So the truth aspect of this is huge. Os Guinness says anti-intellectualism is a disposition to discount the importance of truth and the life of the mind. So for some people who would say, man, it's an intellectual gospel, meaning I'm not really an intellectual, I'm just, no. The pursuit is not to sound smarter. The pursuit is for truth. The pursuit is for truth. And the more that we pursue truth, the more that we begin to understand who God is, the more we understand who God is, the more we have the mind of Christ. And the more that we begin to walk in relationship with him and live our lives as worship. This is huge for us. To those who refuse to read and grow and debate and wrestle, we stand to succumb to this anti-intellectualism that intellectuals help us with. Now here's the downside, or the danger, I should say, of an intellectual. Number one, they can end up loving controversy. I have people like this in my life. They love controversy. Now, there's nothing wrong with some healthy debate, but it can quickly move from healthy debate to just being downright divisive. And that's just not the way of Jesus, and no longer is it worship, but it's more about just being right for being right's sake. Number two is they end up knowing rather than doing. So they're like, man, I figured it all out, and I've got all the ideas in order, and I've got this neat and tidy theology, but then they never get into the mess. And Jesus chastises people like this all throughout the New Testament. It's like, man, you can know all these different things, but if you can't help the guy on the side of the road like the Good Samaritan did, you miss the point altogether. The other danger for the intellectual is that they end up being proud. They become arrogant. They think they figured it out, and they look down on others, which is obviously the opposite of what we're trying to do here in church life. But intellectualism, the pursuit of truth, matters. It's important. We all can respond to it in our worship. Number two is what we call the ascetic. The ascetic loves God in solitude and simplicity. The ascetic temperament gravitates towards solitude, austerity, simplicity, and a deep commitment to God. So these would be like the monastics in our room, right? They're the people who love to go into solitude and just spend time with God and be incredibly diligent and almost militaristic in their style and approach to loving him, because they just want to honor God so badly with their lives. And they're willing to form everything in their life to be disciplined about it. Now, you might say, well, the monastic community, like, does that even exist in the Bible? And I would say, look at individuals like John the Baptist, look at the prophets of old, those who were often off to the side, who were honoring God out in the middle of the wilderness, trusting him with their lives in their formation in solitude. And perhaps the number one ascetic that we can point to is Jesus. Jesus is the best picture of an ascetic. In Matthew chapter 4, it says Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Jesus is spending just vast amounts of time away from everybody else, just in relationship with God, in quiet and in solitude, and into his temptation would launch his entire ministry. And then in Luke 5:16, it says, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. This wasn't a one-off thing. He was constantly moving away. I think this is a big issue in our culture. That we move from thing to thing to thing to thing. And right now, in my life anyway, from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. And in doing all of that, we don't often give ourselves the time to pause and reflect, to be able to sit and meditate and just say, God, what are you saying? We don't give ourselves the sort of space in a culture that constantly rewards doing and merit to just say, be, don't do. And so we need ascetics. We need people who are committed to piety and living a holy life. We need people who are willing to put themselves in on an island a little bit and just pause and reflect. Jesus can enter into the public square healthy because he spent a lot of his life in private getting right and being rested and being centered and being connected to his Father. Is this you? Are you in this pursuit? Here's the problem. This is what Gary Thomas would say. He'd say, true ascetics are strict with themselves, but treat others with supernatural gentleness. Like there is not this desire inside of us to judge others for not being as disciplined as we are or being out away from the crowds as we are. But the danger of the ascetic is that we end up overemphasizing our own personal piety or seek pain for pain's sake as opposed to seeing some of the things that we go without as a form of worship unto God, that we empty ourselves that he might fill us. Or that we seek to gain God's favor by trying to do a bunch of things for him, which we know Christ is enough. His grace is sufficient for us. We don't have to try and earn his approval. Finish with this. The third way and the final way that we'll talk about today is this idea of a traditionalist, the person who loves God through ritual and symbol. We're talking about intellectuals, we're talking about ascetics, but then also talking about traditionalists. What are we talking about? They're the people who, traditionalists that covet faith practices, that move them towards liturgy, symbols, or anything else that leads them towards embodying divine truth. Much of the nation of Israel was built on these liturgical practices that they return to on a regular basis. There are 7 festivals. There are a number of offerings given. There are times and seasons that God asked his people to return to things, not to graduate from them, but to return to them. And traditionalists go, I get that. I get the fact that I need to return to some anchor points for my soul that I never should graduate from. Even in our church and in most churches, we have these anchor points for our soul. We call them Advent and Christmas. We return to the birth of Christ every year in our teaching. We have something called Good Friday and Easter. We return every year to Good Friday and Easter. We're talking about Ash Wednesdays. Some of us are like, what are we talking about? These are anchor points for our soul to return to things. There are things in your life that if you don't return to them on a regular basis, you will forget them. Some of you, today is Valentine's Day. May this not be the day that you show someone you love them. Or we got an issue. But yet, it is important, as a society, we've decided it's important to have a day to return to and to celebrate somebody or something. So we have holidays throughout the course of the year. Listen, you even have a liturgy, things that you return to in your life in other areas. Most of you take a shower every day, and we're all really grateful for it. We call it the liturgy of your life. You eat lunch almost every day. Thank God. That means you've got a level of nutrition about you. You return to it. It's the liturgy of your life. Liturgy forms you over and over and over again. By being someone who takes a shower every day, you are known as a clean person. It has formed you over time. By being someone who eats every day, you're a person who's known as being nutritious in some way. Like, it forms you over time. And the same is true, spiritually speaking. For a traditionalist to be able to return to the thing over and over is something that can form us in a helpful way. We say liturgy is any practice that forms you into who you are becoming. Any practice that forms you into who you are becoming. And so we practice this with regular communion, Christmas, Easter, etc., and with Ash Wednesday. And it's vitally important that we help people to understand these are things in your life that you need to remember. Now, here's the danger of a traditionalist. Serving God without knowing God. We end up in a place where we return to things. We serve God in these ways, but we don't actually know him. We don't let him be forming us fresh. We rely on things from the past. Or we neglect our social obligations. We become so obsessed with returning to things that we miss out on the fact that there are people just on our doorstep that we have a responsibility to go and minister to. Or we end up judging others for not honoring the same traditions that we honor. Or we repeat mechanically or even defy rites where this becomes the essence of our faith altogether. The thing that's most important for all of us is going to be what it means to connect to him. And I don't know how well you connect to God through your intellect, your reason, your mind. But I know this, if you aren't proactively doing so, you're missing out on something. And so I'm gonna give you a practical takeaway. This Wednesday, we have something called Ash Wednesday. It's something each and every year that we return to. And I know some people think the Catholics have co-opted Ash Wednesday, but Presbyterians, Anglicans, there are a lot of different faith traditions within Christianity that have also said, yes, this is a value. We're gonna add on to this. Now some of us would say, well, I just don't understand Ash Wednesday. I don't understand the value of that. Here's what I think the value is that we need to return to on an annual basis. Ash Wednesday kicks off the start of Lent, which mimics the 40 days and 40 nights Jesus had in the wilderness as he fasted. And we use it as a preparation period to Easter, where then we celebrate. And during this period of time with Ash Wednesday, we kick it off with a gathering that simply talks about the denial of self. It's the death of self. From dust you came, to dust you will return. From dust you came, to dust you will return reminds you of the finite nature of your life and everything in it. That every one of us has a responsibility, if we want Christ to increase in our lives, to learn how to decrease. And you can't allow God in sometimes because of how much you filled up your life with the rest of your junk. When you come to a place where you say, I'm ready to empty myself completely, that Christ may fill me, something radically changes on the inside, and God finally gets a hold of your life. And what Ash Wednesday does is it forces us every year to come back to this uncomfortable place that says, I need to learn how to die a little bit to myself. I had to learn how to die. Die to the pleasures of this life, die to the things that I want, dying to all this stuff out here. As the Apostle Paul is talking about, he's saying, listen, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. It's a death that's healthy. It's a death that's right. And when we enter into a gathering like that, there's a level of somberness that comes over us when we realize how much truly needs to be emptied. And we invite you then to join us in fasting, to not just join us for a gathering where some of us will take a mark that says, I am marked by Christ, that this is symbolic of me dying to self, that this is symbolic of me giving all that I am back to Christ. But then entering in over the next 40-day period through Lent to give something up, to die a little bit to self. Now, you may have medical reasons why you can't fast food, or this is just a difficult thing for you and you're not gonna do it, right? Okay, fine, right? What can we fast? Is social media, Netflix? Man, if some of you fasted Netflix during this pandemic, your prayer life would be insane. You'd be insane. Think about it. But if you were to just say no to one of the pleasures in your life, to die a little bit to self, that's not comfortable, no, but it's healthy. It's right. It's something we return to on a regular basis. In fact, I would say this, you don't have to fast with us, but if you're a follower of Jesus, a regular practice of every follower of Jesus through the last 2,000 years of church history has been fasting. So if you're not gonna do it during Lent, when are you gonna do it? When are you gonna go without? When are you gonna die to self? One of the earliest church documents is called the Didache, and in there it talks about the early formation of the church, fasting every Wednesday and every Friday, 2 days a week, every single week. Just 2 days. There is a formation of the earliest church to just go without and to die a little bit to self. And so my challenge to you is to either join us, to use this as a chance to reclaim the value of traditionalism, to reclaim the ascetic's life, and to step into something that you may not have grown up with as a tradition, but to step into it and understand the value and significance of returning, just like you do at Christmas and Easter, returning to something where you empty yourself out in preparation. Do you know how much sweeter Easter is when you do that? You walk in and you're like, man, time to eat, time to feast, time to celebrate. The resurrection means that no longer do you move from death, but you move from death into life. And that's the beauty of that season. So I'm gonna invite you to join us on Wednesday. It'll be formational, an opportunity for you to see God through a new lens. Through this Connecting to God series, may you move from one lens to multiple lenses. And during this series, may you have moved into a place where you've never felt more connected because you've exposed something inside of you that is so much wider. And if you're watching us online, all the more reason why this series matters. That we've got one limited lens, but there are so many other things for you to lean into and to know him during this time. We've just tried to set the table. I want to pray for you, and then our team is going to lead us in one final song today. And let's just use it as a chance to worship. If that's uncomfortable for you, maybe you're new to this thing, use it as a time of reflection. But let's use this as a space where he can be lifted up as we set the table today to come into his presence. Let's pray together.